Chapter 1. The Dashwood Family. For very many years, there had been Dashwoods living in Sussex, in the south of England. The family owned a large area of land around their country house, Norland Park. Recently, the head of the family, an unmarried man of great age, had invited into his home his nephew, who was expected to inherit the house and land, with his wife and children. The nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, and his wife behaved kindly and thoughtfully towards the old gentleman, not from interest in his fortune, but from goodness of heart, so that he was able to spend his last years comfortably with these pleasant and cheerful companions. By his first wife, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, John. By his present wife, 3 daughters. John, a respectable, serious young man, had received a large inheritance from his mother, and had also added to his wealth by his own marriage. To him, therefore, the Norland fortune was not as important as to his sisters, who had very little money of their own. When the old gentleman died, it was discovered that he had not left his fortune to Henry Dashwood to do what he liked with, but only to use during his lifetime. On Henry Dashwood's death, the inheritance would pass to his son John, and to John's son, a child of 4 years old. The old man had become fond of the small boy on his occasional visits to Norland, and so a spoilt child was preferred to Henry Dashwood's gentle wife and daughters, in spite of their years of loving care. No unkindness had been intended, however, and as a sign of his affection for the girls, the old gentleman left them £1,000 each. At first, Mr. Henry Dashwood was bitterly disappointed, as he had wanted the fortune more for his wife and daughters than for himself. But he soon realised that if he was careful with money in the next few years, he could save enough to provide generously for his family. Unfortunately, he did not live to carry out this plan, as he survived his uncle by only 1 year, and £10,000 was all that remained for his widow and daughters. Just before his death, he sent for his son, and begged him to take care of his stepmother and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but such a request at such a time naturally had an effect on him, so he promised to do everything he could to make his father's family comfortable. He was not a bad young man, but rather cold-hearted and rather selfish, although he was, in general, well respected. If he had married a pleasanter woman, he would probably have been even more respected, and perhaps have become pleasanter himself, but his wife was colder and more selfish than he was. As soon as his father was dead and buried, Mrs. John Dashwood arrived unexpectedly at Norland with her child and her servants. She wished to make it clear that, as the house belonged to her husband from the moment of his father's death, she did not need any invitation from her mother-in-law. To a widow in Mrs. Dashwood's situation, this appeared unforgivable. In fact, Mrs. Dashwood, a sensitive and generous woman, felt so strongly about her daughter-in-law's unpleasant behaviour that she would have left the house immediately if her eldest daughter had not begged her to reconsider. Eleanor, this eldest daughter, whose advice was so useful, had a great deal of intelligence and common sense, and although only 19, frequently acted as her mother's adviser. To the advantage of the whole family, she was often able to persuade Mrs. Dashwood to hold back the violent enthusiasms which were likely to lead them all into difficulties. Eleanor had an excellent heart, full of affection, and although her feelings were strong, she knew how to control them. This was something which her mother had not yet learnt to do, and which Marianne, one of her sisters, had decided never to learn. Marianne was, like Eleanor, generous, clever, and sensitive, but unlike Eleanor, she was eager in everything. Her feelings were always strongly felt and expressed. In this, she was very similar to her mother. Eleanor saw with concern how little her sister could control her feelings, but her mother loved Marianne for her sensibility. Now, after Mr. Henry Dashwood's death, Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne encouraged each other in the violence of their unhappiness, becoming more and more miserable as they remembered the past and thought bitterly of the future. Eleanor, too, suffered deeply, but she could still make an effort to discuss business with her brother, be polite to her sister-in-law, and try to persuade her mother to be calmer. The youngest sister, Margaret, was a pleasant girl of 13, but as she already had some of Marianne's sensibility and not much of her intelligence, she seemed likely to grow up without her sister's advantages. Mrs. John Dashwood now made sure that everyone knew she was mistress of Norland, and that her mother-in-law and sisters-in-law were there as visitors. Her husband, however, reminded her of the promise he had given to his dying father, that he would take care of his stepmother and sisters. "I had thought, my dear," he added, "of giving the girls £1,000 each. It would certainly be a generous present for them." Mrs. John Dashwood did not at all approve of this. It would mean taking £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy. She begged her husband to think again. How could he rob his child, and his only child too, of so much money? And how could the Miss Dashwoods, who were related to him only by half-blood, which she considered no relation at all, possibly expect him to be so generous? "It was my father's last request to me," replied her husband. "I must keep my promise to him. I must do something for them when they leave Norland for a new home." "Well, then, do something for them. But you need not give them £3,000. Consider that when you have given the money, it will never come back. Your sisters will marry, and it will be gone from the family for ever." "You are right, my dear," said her husband seriously. "Perhaps I should give them half that. £500 would be a valuable present for them." "Oh, beyond anything. What brother on earth would do half as much for his sisters, even if really his sisters, and as it is, only half-blood? But you have such a generous nature." "I would not wish to do anything mean. It is better on such occasions to do too much rather than too little. Even they themselves cannot expect more." "There is no knowing what they may expect," said the lady. "But the question is what you can afford to do." "Certainly, and I think I can afford to give them £500 each. As it is, without my money, they will each have more than £3,000 on their mother's death, a very comfortable fortune for any young woman." "Indeed it is. And in fact, I begin to think they need no extra money at all. They will be able to live very comfortably together on the interest of their £10,000. "That is very true. And therefore I wonder whether, on the whole, it would be more advisable to pay some money regularly to my stepmother during her lifetime, instead of giving money to the girls. 100 a year would make her and the girls, while they live with her, perfectly comfortable." His wife hesitated a little over this plan. "That is certainly better than giving £1,500 all at once, but if Mrs. Dashwood should live for longer than 15 years, it would cost us more." She is very fit and healthy, and only just 40, and it is an unpleasant thing to have to pay the money out every year. One feels one's fortune is not one's own. I believe you are right, my love. Whatever I can give them occasionally will be of far greater assistance than a yearly allowance, because they would only live more expensively if they felt sure of receiving a larger income. If I give them a present of £50 now and then, I will, I think, be keeping my promise to my father in the fullest manner. To be sure you will. Indeed, to tell the truth, I am certain your father had no idea of your giving them any money at all. The assistance he was thinking of was, I dare say, looking for a comfortable, small house for them, helping them to move their furniture, and sending them occasional presents of fish and meat in season. Do consider, Mr. Dashwood, how very cheaply they will live. No carriage, no horses, and only 1 or 2 servants. I cannot imagine how they will spend half their money, and it is foolish to think of giving them more. They will much more be able to give you something. I believe you are perfectly right, said Mr. Dashwood. Now I understand clearly what my father meant, and he decided to offer no more to his father's widow and daughters than such neighbourly assistance as his wife suggested. Meanwhile, his stepmother, impatient to leave Norland, which held so many memories for her, had been looking for a suitable house to move into not too far away. Several houses, which she would have approved, had already been turned down by Eleanor as too large for their income, and the search continued. 6 months passed, with the 2 families living at Norland. Mrs. Dashwood came to dislike her daughter-in-law more and more, and would have found it impossible to live in the same house with her for so long, if something had not happened to make Mrs. Dashwood want to keep her daughters at Norland for a while. She had noticed a growing attachment between her eldest girl and Mrs. John Dashwood's brother, a gentlemanly and pleasing young man who had come to Norland soon after his sister's arrival, and who had spent the greater part of his time there since then. Edward Ferrars was the elder son of a man who had died very rich, but his future wealth was uncertain, because the whole of his fortune depended on his mother's wishes. Neither of these facts influenced Mrs. Dashwood. It was enough for her that he loved her daughter, and that Eleanor returned his affection. Edward Ferrars was not handsome, nor were his manners especially pleasing at first sight, but when he lost his shyness, his behaviour showed what an open, affectionate heart he had. His mother and sister wanted him to make a fine figure in the world in some way, but Edward was not ambitious. All his wishes were for home comforts and the quietness of private life. Fortunately, he had a younger brother, Robert, who was more promising. Mrs. Dashwood completely approved of Edward, in spite of his quiet manner, which was so unlike the way she felt a young man should behave. As soon as she saw the smallest sign of love in his behaviour to Eleanor, she considered their serious attachment as certain, and looked forward to their marriage in the near future. "In a few months, my dear Marianne," she said, "Eleanor will be married. We shall miss her, but she will be happy." "Oh, Mamma, how shall we manage without her?" "My love, we shall live within a few miles of her and see her every day. You will have a brother, a real, affectionate brother." "But you look serious, Marianne. Do you disapprove of your sister's choice?" "Perhaps I am a little surprised, Mamma. He is very pleasant, but there is something missing. There is no fire in his eyes, and I am afraid, Mamma, he has no real taste. He does not seem very interested in music, and I think he knows little of drawing or painting. And he is so calm when we discuss or read beautiful writing. It breaks my heart to hear him talk so quietly and with so little sensibility about things that matter so much to me. I could not be happy with a man who does not share all my feelings. Eleanor may be happy with him, as she has not my feelings. But, Mamma, the more I know of the world, the more I am certain I shall never see a man I can really love. Remember, my love, you are not 17 yet. It is too early in life to lose hope of happiness. Why should you be less fortunate than your mother? Eleanor herself felt that Edward stood very high in her opinion. She believed that he also felt warmly towards her, but she was not sure enough of this to be comfortable with her sister's and mother's dreams of marriage for her. Edward sometimes appeared strangely depressed when he was with her, which worried her a little. She knew that his mother was making life difficult for him, and would perhaps disapprove of his marrying a woman with no great fortune. But sometimes she feared that he thought of her as no more than a friend. Marianne and her mother had no such doubts, believing strongly that any intelligent young man must love Eleanor, and that love itself would solve all problems. Marianne, indeed, was quite horrified when her sister cautiously described her feelings for Edward as liking and respect, rather than love. Like him? Respect him? She cried. Oh, cold-hearted Eleanor! Why should you be ashamed of expressing love? Mrs. John Dashwood had also noticed the attachment between her brother and Eleanor. It made her uneasy, and she took the first opportunity of upsetting her mother-in-law by explaining her family's high ambitions for Edward and the importance of his marrying well, and the danger for any young woman attempting to trap him into marriage. Mrs. Dashwood could not prevent herself from giving a sharp answer, and left the room at once, determined, in spite of the inconvenience, to remove herself and her daughters from Norland as soon as possible. On the same day, she received a letter from Sir John Middleton, a gentleman who was a distant relation of hers. He wrote to offer her a small house near his home in Devonshire, where she and her girls could make their new home. Although it was only a cottage, he promised to do anything necessary to make it more comfortable. His letter was written in such a friendly way, and she was so anxious to leave Norland and her unfeeling daughter-in-law, that after first asking Eleanor's opinion, Mrs. Dashwood wrote to accept Sir John Middleton's kind offer. Chapter 2. A New Home. Mrs. Dashwood took great pleasure in informing her stepson and his wife that she had found a house, and that she and her daughters would soon trouble them no longer. Mrs. John Dashwood said nothing, but her husband showed some surprise. "I do hope," he said politely, "that you will not be far from Norland." Mrs. Dashwood replied with a smile that they were going to Devonshire. Edward Ferrars, who was in the room at the time, turned quickly towards her when he heard this. "Devonshire?" he repeated. "Are you really going there? So far from here. And to what part, may I ask?" "A place called Barton, 4 miles north of the city of Exeter," replied Mrs. Dashwood. "It is only a cottage, but I hope that many of my friends will come to visit me there." She gave a very kind invitation to Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood to visit her at Barton, and to Edward she gave one with even greater affection. Although her recent conversation with her daughter-in-law had made her determined to leave Norland as soon as possible, she did not in the least intend that Edward and Eleanor should be separated. By giving such a clear invitation to Edward, she wished to show that her daughter-in-law's disapproval of the attachment between Edward and Eleanor had not had the smallest effect. Mr. John Dashwood told his stepmother again and again how extremely sorry he was that she had taken a house so distant from Norland that he could not give her assistance in moving her furniture. He really did feel sorry, because he had decided to limit his promise to his father to this one offer of help, which would not now be of any use. The furniture was sent to Devonshire by ship. It mainly consisted of sheets, dinner plates, books, and a handsome piano of Marianne's. Mrs. John Dashwood was sorry to see the boxes leave. She felt it unnecessary for Mrs. Dashwood, who had such a small income, to have any good furniture at all. Mrs. Dashwood took the house, Barton Cottage, for 12 months. It was furnished and ready for them to move into at once. All the necessary arrangements were quickly made. Eleanor advised her mother to sell her carriage, which, with the horses, would cost too much to keep, and to limit the number of their servants to 3. 2 of the servants were sent to Devonshire immediately, to prepare the house for their mistress's arrival. On his deathbed, Henry Dashwood had told his wife of the promise his son had made, and Mrs. Dashwood had never doubted that John would keep that promise. Now, as she and her daughters were about to leave Norland, was a most suitable time for him to offer them help. But Mrs. Dashwood soon began to lose hope. He so frequently talked of the rising costs of managing his house and land that he seemed in need of more money himself, rather than having any intention of giving money away. Soon they were ready to depart, and many were the tears that fell during their goodbyes to the home they loved so much. "Dear, dear Norland," said Marianne, walking alone in the park on their last evening. "I shall miss you all my life." During the first part of their journey to Devonshire, they were too miserable to notice anything. But when they entered Barton Valley, they became more cheerful and began to show interest in the countryside that would soon be part of their everyday life. It was a pleasant green valley, with thick woods and open fields. After driving for more than a mile, they reached their house. Barton Cottage was well built and in good condition. There were 2 sitting rooms downstairs, and 4 bedrooms and 2 servants' rooms upstairs. Compared with Norland, it was certainly poor and small, and the girls' tears flowed as they remembered their family home. But they soon dried their eyes and made every effort to be happy. Mrs. Dashwood was, on the whole, very pleased with the house, but she looked forward to making some changes. "We can make ourselves quite comfortable here for the moment," she said, "as it is too late in the year to start any building work. To be sure, the house is rather too small for us, but perhaps next year, if I have plenty of money, as I expect I shall, we may think about enlarging the sitting rooms and adding a new dining room and another bedroom. That may be easily done. It is a pity the stairs are not more handsome, but I suppose it would not be difficult to widen them. I shall see how much I have saved in the spring." It was not quite clear how all this work could be done from the savings of an income of 500 a year by a woman who had never saved in her life. So meanwhile, they were wise enough to accept the house as it was. They spent their first day arranging their things around them to make themselves a home. Soon after breakfast the next day, they received a visit from their landlord, the gentleman who owned Barton Cottage. Sir John Middleton was a good-looking, cheerful man of about 40, who seemed really delighted by their arrival. He welcomed them to Barton, offering them anything from his own house and garden, Barton Park, that was lacking at the cottage. He showed a warm interest in their comfort, and hoped that they would meet his own family socially as often as possible. His kindness was not limited to words, because soon after he had left them, a large basket full of fruit and vegetables arrived from the park, followed by another of meat and fish. His wife, Lady Middleton, came to visit them the next day. The Dashwoods were, of course, very anxious to see a person on whom so much of their comfort at Barton must depend. Although at first they admired the elegance of her appearance and her manners, they soon realised that she did not have her husband's warmth or anything of interest to say. However, there was no lack of conversation, as Lady Middleton had wisely brought her eldest child with her, a fine little boy of about 6. As a result, there was always something to talk about. The ladies had to ask his name and age, admire his beauty, and ask him questions which his mother answered for him. A child should be taken on every social call in order to assist conversation. In the present situation, it took at least 10 minutes to determine whether the boy was most like his father or mother, and why. Everybody thought differently, and everybody was astonished at the opinions of the others. The Dashwoods would soon be given the chance to discuss the rest of the children, as Sir John had made them promise to have dinner at the park the next day. Barton Park was about half a mile from the cottage. It was a large, handsome house, where the Middletons lived in great comfort. Neither of them had taste or any interest in books or music. Sir John was a sportsman, Lady Middleton a mother. He could only go shooting for half the year, while his wife was able to spoil her children all year round. He was so hospitable that they almost always had relations or friends staying in the house. But Lady Middleton's main interest lay in the elegance of her table and her domestic arrangements, of which she was extremely proud. Sir John's enjoyment of society was much more real than his wife's. He took delight in collecting about him more young people than his house would hold, and the noisier they were, the better he liked it. Barton Park was famous for its summer parties and excursions, and its winter dances. Sir John was delighted with Mrs. Dashwood and her young, pretty daughters. When they arrived at the park that evening, he was at the door to welcome them, and repeated several times his concern that he had been unable to get any fashionable young men to meet them. There was, he said, only one gentleman there, a particular friend who was staying at the house, but who was neither very young nor very sociable. He apologised for the smallness of the party and promised that it would never happen again. Luckily, Lady Middleton's mother had just arrived, and as she was a cheerful, pleasant woman, he hoped the young ladies would not find the evening too dull. Mrs. Jennings, his mother-in-law, was a cheerful, fat, rather vulgar old lady, who laughed and talked a great deal. During dinner, she said many amusing things about lovers and husbands, and hoped the Miss Dashwoods had not left their hearts behind them in Sussex. Colonel Brandon, Sir John's particular friend, seemed as different from his friend as Mrs. Jennings was from her daughter. He was silent and serious. His appearance, however, was not unpleasing, in spite of his being, in Marianne's and Margaret's opinion, an absolute old bachelor, because he was on the wrong side of 35. After dinner, Marianne was invited to sing and play the piano. Sir John was loud in his admiration at the end of every song, and as loud in his conversation with others while every song lasted. Lady Middleton frowned at him for talking, but then requested a song which Marianne had just finished. Only Colonel Brandon listened attentively, without any false show of delight. Marianne felt a respect for him that the others, with their lack of taste, did not deserve. He clearly took pleasure in music, although perhaps not with her own depth of feeling. However, she was reasonable enough to accept that a man as old as 35, like the Colonel, may well have outlived real feeling and true enjoyment. Mrs. Jennings was a widow with a comfortable fortune. She had lived to see both her daughters respectably married, and now had nothing to do but to marry off the rest of the world. She spent most of her time planning weddings for all the young people she knew, and was remarkably quick at discovering attachments. Soon after her arrival at Barton, this quickness enabled her to inform the Middletons and the Dashwoods that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne. She was perfectly sure of it. It would be an excellent marriage, as he was rich and she was handsome. For a long time Mrs. Jennings had been eager to get Colonel Brandon well married, and she was always anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. The immediate advantage to herself was that she could make endless jokes against them both. At the cottage, she laughed at Marianne, and at the park, she laughed at the Colonel. Marianne herself did not know whether to be amused or annoyed. "It is such a silly accusation, Mamma, and I think it very unfeeling of Mrs. Jennings to laugh so cruelly at old Colonel Brandon. He is old enough to be my father." "My dear," said Mrs. Dashwood, smiling, "I cannot think a man 5 years younger than myself so extremely ancient as he appears to you." "But, Mamma, really, he must have long outlived any feelings of love by now, if he ever had any when he was younger. When is a man to be safe from such cruel jokes if age and bodily weakness cannot protect him?" "Bodily weakness?" said Eleanor. "I know that he is older than we are, but surely you must accept that he still has the full use of his arms and legs. Did you not hear him complain of having a bad back?" "My dearest child," said her mother, laughing, "it must seem to you quite astonishing that my life has lasted to the great age of 40. Mamma, be serious. I know very well that Colonel Brandon is not old enough for his friends to worry yet about losing him. He may live for another 20 years. But 35 should have nothing to do with marriage." "Perhaps," said Eleanor, 35 and 17 had better not have anything to do with marriage together. But a single woman of 27, for example, could easily consider Colonel Brandon's 35 years no disadvantage. "A woman of 27, said Marianne, after a moment's thought, can never hope to feel true love again. And if her home is uncomfortable or her fortune small, I suppose that she could accept the duties of a nurse in order to become a wife. It would be a marriage of convenience if Colonel Brandon married such a woman. The world would be happy with it, but in my eyes it would be no marriage at all." "It seems a little hard," said Eleanor reasonably, "that you consider Colonel Brandon so ill that he is in need of nursing, only because he happened to complain yesterday of a pain in his shoulder. After all, it was a cold, wet day." But Marianne's views remained the same. Soon after this, however, when Eleanor had left the room, Marianne spoke to her mother with some urgency in her voice. "Mamma, I am anxious about Edward Ferrars. I am sure he is ill. We have now been here almost 2 weeks, and he still has not come to see Eleanor." "My dear, be patient," answered Mrs. Dashwood. "I did not expect him so soon, and I feel sure Eleanor does not expect him either. When we were talking yesterday of a new fireplace for the spare bedroom, she said there was no hurry, as the room would not be needed for some time." "How strange! What can be the meaning of it? How cold, how calm their last goodbyes were. And Eleanor is so self-controlled. She is never sad or restless or miserable. I cannot understand her." Chapter 3. A Handsome Stranger. The Miss Dashwoods now began to feel really at home at Barton. They went walking and practised their drawing and music with far greater enjoyment than at any time since the death of their father. They did not have many visitors, except for those from Barton Park, as there were few other houses within walking distance. There was, in fact, a large, comfortable-looking house about a mile from the cottage, in the village of Allenham, but they heard that its owner, an old lady of good character called Mrs. Smith, was unfortunately not well enough to mix in society. There were beautiful walks all around them, in the green wooded valleys and on the hills behind the cottage. One morning, Marianne and Margaret, taking no notice of their mother's and Eleanor's warnings of rain, decided to walk on one of these hills. They climbed to the top, delighted to see blue sky between the clouds, and laughing at the wind that caught at their hair and clothes. "Nothing in the world could be better than this," called Marianne. "What a pity Mamma and Eleanor did not come with us." But in a few minutes, the blue sky disappeared, the dark clouds gathered, and driving rain began to beat down on their faces. Surprised and disappointed, they were forced to turn back. Fortunately, they were not far from home. It was just a matter of running with all possible speed down the steep side of the hill which led to their garden gate. At first, Marianne was ahead, but a false step brought her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret, unable to stop herself, carried on down the hill and through the garden gate. A gentleman, who was out shooting, was walking up the hill when Marianne's accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to help her. She had hurt her ankle and could not stand. The gentleman offered his assistance, and in spite of Marianne's protests, took her up in his arms and carried her down the hill. He took her straight into the house and placed her carefully on a sofa in the sitting room. Eleanor and her mother rose in astonishment as the stranger entered, carrying Marianne. While they both looked at him, secretly admiring his unusually handsome appearance, he apologized most politely for his rude entrance. Even if he had been old, ugly, and vulgar, Mrs. Dashwood would have been extremely grateful to him for taking care of her child. But the influence of his looks and elegance touched her deepest feelings. She thanked him again and again, and asked the name of the person to whom she owed so much. He replied that his name was Willoughby. His present home was at Allenham, and he sincerely hoped that she would allow him to call tomorrow to inquire after Miss Dashwood. Permission was immediately given, and he then departed, to make himself still more interesting in the middle of a heavy shower of rain. There was general admiration of his manly beauty. Marianne had seen less of his person than the others, because of her natural confusion when he lifted her in his arms, but his appearance and behaviour seemed all that was perfect to her. Her imagination was busy, her thoughts were pleasant, and the pain of a turned ankle went unnoticed. When Sir John next visited them, he heard all about Marianne's accident, and was eagerly asked whether he knew of any gentleman of the name of Willoughby at Allenham. "Willoughby!" cried Sir John. "Of course I do. He comes here every year. I shall invite him to dinner on Thursday." "What sort of young man is he?" "A good man to know, I can tell you. He shoots well, and there isn't a better rider in England." "And is that all you can say for him?" cried Marianne. "But what does he think? What are the interests close to his heart?" Sir John looked puzzled. "Well, I don't know as much as that about him, but he's pleasant and sociable, and has got the nicest little gun dog I ever saw. Did you see his dog?" "But who is he?" asked Eleanor. "Where does he come from? Where does he live? Has he a house at Allenham?" This time Sir John had more exact answers to give. He told them Mr. Willoughby had no house of his own in Devonshire, but stayed there only while visiting the old lady Mrs. Smith at Allenham. It appeared that he was related to her and would inherit her fortune. "Yes," Sir John added to Eleanor, "he is well worth catching. He has a house and land in Somerset as well. And if I were you, I wouldn't allow my younger sister to have him, in spite of all this falling down hills. Miss Marianne must not expect to have all the men to herself." Brandon will be jealous if she does not take care." "I do not believe," said Mrs. Dashwood, smiling, "that either of my daughters will make any attempts at what you call catching him. It is not an employment to which they have been brought up. Men are very safe with us, however rich they are. I am glad to hear, however, that he is a respectable young man whom we can meet socially." "I remember last Christmas," said Sir John, "at a little dance at the park. He danced from 8 till 4 without once sitting down, and he was up again at 8 to go shooting." "Was he?" cried Marianne with shining eyes. "That is what I like. A young man who is enthusiastic and eager in all he does, who never gets tired." "I see how it will be," said Sir John. "You will be interested in him now, and never think of poor Brandon." Marianne's rescuer, as Margaret called him, arrived at the cottage early next morning, and was received by Mrs. Dashwood with more than politeness. During his visit, Willoughby rapidly became aware of the sense, elegance, affection, and domestic comfort of the family to whom an accident had introduced him. Both Eleanor and Marianne had pretty faces and lovely figures, but in Marianne's beautiful dark eyes burned an eager fire which drew Willoughby to her. She could not be silent when he spoke of music and dancing, and showed no shyness in their discussion. They soon discovered how many interests and opinions they shared, and long before his visit came to an end, they were talking and laughing together like old friends. Willoughby visited Barton Cottage every day after that. At first his intention was supposedly to inquire politely after Marianne's health, but soon he pretended no longer, and came to spend the whole day at her side in complete enjoyment of her company. They read, they talked, they sang together, and Marianne found in Willoughby all the taste and sensibility which Edward Ferrars unfortunately lacked. Mrs. Dashwood considered him as faultless as Marianne did. Even Eleanor saw nothing wrong in him, except for the habit, which Marianne shared, of being too ready to express an opinion about other people, and of putting his personal pleasure above social correctness. Marianne now began to realize she had been wrong to believe there was no such creature as the perfect man. Willoughby met her idea of perfection exactly, and his behaviour showed that he shared her wishes for their future. Her mother, too, had thoughts of their marriage, and secretly congratulated herself on having two such sons-in-law as Edward and Willoughby. Eleanor, however, was concerned to see that Mrs. Jennings had been right, and Colonel Brandon appeared to be deeply in love with Marianne. What hope could there be for a silent man of 35 against a sociable one of 25? Perhaps she pitied him even more, because Willoughby and Marianne seemed determined to laugh at him for being old and dull. "Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day, "whom everybody speaks well of, and nobody cares for." "He is respected by all the family at the park, however," said Eleanor sharply, "and his conversation is always pleasant." "But he has nothing of interest to say," cried Marianne. "He has common sense. That is what I like about him. He is perfectly respectable, well-informed, and, I believe, sincere." "Well, Miss Dashwood," said Willoughby, laughing, "I have 3 unanswerable reasons for disliking Colonel Brandon. He told me it would rain when I wanted it to be fine. He does not approve of my new carriage, and I cannot persuade him to buy my horse. So, in spite of your very sensible opinion, I shall go on disliking him forever." When they moved to Barton, the Dashwoods never imagined that their days would be so completely filled with parties, visits, and excursions. Sir John could not rest if there were young people to amuse, and every day there was a boat trip, or a supper party, or a drive in the countryside, or a dance at the park. In every meeting of the kind Willoughby was included, which gave him the opportunity to develop his connection with the Dashwood family, to show his deep admiration for Marianne, and to receive, in her behaviour to himself, the clearest possible proof of her affection. Eleanor could not be surprised at their attachment. She only wished it could be less openly shown, and once or twice tried to suggest to Marianne that she should have more self-control. But Marianne, and Willoughby too, believed that real feelings should never be hidden, and that it would be false to do so. When Willoughby was present, Marianne had eyes for no one else. Eleanor's happiness was not as great as her sister's. In Devonshire she had found no companion who could make her forget the delights of her former home and Sussex friends. Only Colonel Brandon came closest to being the kind of friend she needed. He often fell into conversation with her, as he seemed to find some relief in talking to her about Marianne. "Your sister, I understand, does not approve of second attachments," he said one evening, his eyes fixed on Marianne, who was dancing with Willoughby. "No," replied Eleanor. "Her opinions are all romantic. She believes that we fall in love once only in our lives. But I hope that in a few years she will become more sensible." "That may happen. But when a romantic young mind is forced to change, what serious results there can be. I speak from experience. I knew a young lady once who—" Here he stopped suddenly, and appeared to think he had said too much. Eleanor felt almost sure that his was a story of disappointed love, and her pity for him grew. The next morning, Eleanor heard a piece of news that astonished her. Marianne told her with the greatest delight that Willoughby had promised to give her a horse so that he and she could go riding together. She had not given a moment's thought to the cost of keeping the animal, or to what society might think of her receiving such an expensive present from a young man who was not a relation. It took Eleanor some time to make her understand that she could not possibly accept the gift, but finally Marianne agreed, although unwillingly. The next day, Eleanor gained a still clearer picture of Marianne's attachment to Willoughby. Margaret came excitedly to tell her that she was sure Marianne would marry Willoughby very soon. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you. I saw them last night after tea. Mr. Willoughby was begging Marianne for something, and then he cut off a long lock of her hair, kissed it, and put it in his pocket." Eleanor now felt sure they were engaged, and was only surprised that they had not told their relations and friends. Sir John's latest plan for their amusement was to visit a very fine house and garden called Whitwell the following day. A large group of them would go in carriages, taking food and drink with them in baskets, and a most enjoyable day was expected. As Whitwell belonged to Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law, the Colonel would go with them. It appeared that he alone could arrange for them to visit the house. Unfortunately, however, while they were at breakfast at the park, where the whole party had gathered, a letter was delivered to the Colonel. He looked quickly at it, and hurried out of the room without a word. In a few moments he returned, looking more serious than usual, and explained that urgent business called him to London, and he would not, therefore, be able to join the party visiting Whitwell. He would not explain further, in spite of Mrs. Jennings' insistent questioning. Everybody except Eleanor tried hard to persuade him to put off his business so that the excursion could take place, but he could not be influenced, and left the house after wishing them a good day. As the excursion was no longer possible, it was decided that the party would drive around the countryside instead, and the carriages were ordered. Willoughby's was first, and Marianne never looked happier than when she got into it. He drove away very fast, and they were soon out of sight. Nothing more was seen of them until their return in the afternoon. That evening, as they all sat down to dinner, Mrs. Jennings spoke quietly to Marianne, but loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "I have found you out, miss, in spite of your cleverness. I know where you spent the morning." Marianne blushed and said quickly, "Where?" Mrs. Jennings smiled knowingly. "I hope you like your house, Miss Marianne. It is certainly very large, and when I come to see you in it, I hope you will have refurnished it. It badly needed new furniture when I was last there." Marianne turned away in confusion. Mrs. Jennings laughed loudly and explained that she had discovered from the servants that Marianne and Willoughby had gone to Allenham and spent a considerable time going all over Mrs. Smith's house. Eleanor found this difficult to believe. Marianne had never been introduced to Mrs. Smith, and it would have been very bad manners for her to enter the house while Mrs. Smith was in it. However, when she asked her sister, she found that the story was true, and Marianne was quite angry with her for doubting it. "Why should I not visit the house?" cried Marianne. "I never spent a pleasanter morning in my life." "I am afraid," replied Eleanor quietly but firmly, "that whatever is pleasant is not always correct." After some minutes of serious thought, Marianne said, "Perhaps, Eleanor, you may be right. I should not have gone. But the rooms are lovely. There is a beautiful little sitting room which would be delightful with modern furniture." She would have described every room in the house if Eleanor had let her. Eleanor had no time to wonder why Colonel Brandon had been so suddenly called away. All her thoughts now centred on Marianne and Willoughby's extraordinary silence about their engagement. There seemed no reason why they should not openly tell her mother and herself, even if they did not plan to marry very soon. Willoughby was not rich. Indeed, he often complained he was poor, so he might have to wait for his inheritance before marrying. But this secrecy was so opposed to their general ideas of openness and honesty that Eleanor began to doubt whether they were really engaged. Nothing could express more affection for them all than Willoughby's behaviour. He seemed to consider the cottage his home, and when Mrs. Dashwood mentioned the future building work she was planning, he appeared almost horrified and begged her not to change even one stone. "No, Mrs. Dashwood," he cried, "do not spoil this house. It is perfect as it is. Remember what happiness I have known here. Promise me you will change nothing, nothing at all." To please him, Mrs. Dashwood dutifully promised. "I am glad of your promise. Now I would ask you one more thing. Tell me that not only your home will remain the same, but that I shall always find you and your family unchanged, and that you will always consider me with the kindness which has made you all so dear to me." The promise was given, and Willoughby's behaviour that evening was a proof of his happiness in their society. Chapter 4. Departures and Arrivals. The next morning, Mrs. Dashwood, with 2 of her daughters, went to visit Lady Middleton. Marianne wished to remain at home, and her mother, thinking that no doubt Willoughby had promised to call on her while she was alone, was quite happy to agree. When they returned from the park, they found, as expected, Willoughby's carriage waiting outside the cottage. But what they did not expect, as they entered the house, was to see Marianne rush out of the sitting-room, sobbing uncontrollably, and run upstairs. Surprised and worried, they went into the room, where they found only Willoughby. His face showed signs of the same strong feelings that had moved Marianne. "Is Marianne ill?" cried Mrs. Dashwood. "I hope not," he replied, trying to look cheerful. "Indeed, it is I who may expect to be ill, as I am now suffering under a very heavy disappointment. I am unable to visit you any longer. My cousin, Mrs. Smith, has this morning decided to send me to London on business. As a poor, dependent relation, I must do what she asks. I have already left Allenham, and now I have come to say good-bye to you." "This is very unfortunate. But Mrs. Smith's business will not keep you from us for very long, I hope." He reddened as he replied, "You are very kind, but I have no hope of returning to Devonshire immediately. My visits to Mrs. Smith are never repeated within the year." "And is Mrs. Smith your only friend? Is Allenham the only house where you are welcome? My dear Willoughby, surely you do not need to wait for an invitation to Barton Cottage." His colour deepened, and with his eyes fixed on the ground, he only replied, "You are too good." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Eleanor with surprise, and Eleanor felt just as astonished. After a moment's silence, Willoughby added confusedly, "At present my time is not my own. I cannot hope—" He stopped. Then, smiling weakly, he said, "It is foolish to go on in this manner. I will not punish myself any longer by remaining among friends whose society it is impossible for me now to enjoy." Hurriedly he said goodbye and left the house. His carriage was soon out of sight. Mrs. Dashwood's concern and alarm at his sudden departure were too great for her to express. Eleanor also felt extremely disturbed by Willoughby's changed behaviour. One moment she feared that he had never had any serious intention of marrying Marianne, and the next that some unfortunate argument had taken place between him and her sister. But her strongest feeling was one of pity for Marianne, who must now be in the depths of the most violent sorrow, and her romantic nature would consider it a duty to feed and encourage her misery. Soon Mrs. Dashwood felt able to discuss the situation with her eldest daughter. She was now more cheerful, and had persuaded herself that Willoughby was only leaving Devonshire on the orders of his rich relation, because Mrs. Smith suspected and disapproved of his engagement to Marianne. "His dearest wish," she went on, "will be to return to Barton as soon as he can." Eleanor, listening patiently, agreed that this was quite possible. "But if they are engaged," she said, "although it may be necessary to hide the truth from Mrs. Smith, there is no reason to hide it from us." "My dear child," cried her mother, "it is strange for you to accuse Willoughby and Marianne of hiding their feelings when you have accused them of showing their feelings too openly." "I want no proof of their affection," said Eleanor, "but of their engagement I do. I am perfectly happy with both. Has not his behaviour to Marianne, for at least the last fortnight, shown that he loved her and considered her his future wife? Is it possible, Eleanor, to doubt their engagement? Willoughby must be aware of your sister's love for him. How could he leave her, perhaps for months, without telling her of his affection?" "I confess," said Eleanor, "that everything points towards their engagement. Except for one thing. Their silence on the subject. And for me, that is the greatest difficulty of all. Oh, Eleanor, I do not understand you. You prefer to believe in bad rather than good. Do you suspect Willoughby? But is he not a man of honour and feeling? You cannot really think he is deceiving Marianne." "I hope not. I believe not," cried Eleanor. "I sincerely love Willoughby, and I find it painful to suspect his intentions. Perhaps indeed you are right, and there is a simple explanation for his strange behaviour this morning." They saw nothing of Marianne until dinner, when she took her place at the table without saying a word. Her eyes were red and her face pale. She avoided looking at anyone and could neither eat nor speak. She continued in the depths of misery all evening. Any mention of anything to do with Willoughby made her burst into tears instantly, and although her family were most anxious for her comfort, it was impossible for them to keep clear of every subject which her feelings connected with him. Marianne would have thought herself very insensitive if she had been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face if she had not risen from her bed more in need of rest than when she lay down on it. But there was no danger of this happening. She spent most of the night sobbing bitterly. and got up with a headache. She passed the rest of the day, and several more days after that, in feeding her sorrow, by playing all Willoughby's favourite songs, by reading the books they used to read together, and by walking alone on the hills where they used to walk, until her heart was so heavy that no further sadness could be added. No letter from Willoughby came, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again began to worry. One morning, about a week later, Eleanor persuaded Marianne to join her sisters in a walk. As they went along the road away from the cottage, they saw a gentleman riding towards them, and at once Marianne cried out in delight, "It is he! I know it is!" She ran eagerly to meet him. But Eleanor called out, "Marianne, I think you are wrong. It is not Willoughby." But Marianne would not listen, and continued running until she was quite near the rider, when she stopped suddenly. She had realised it was not Willoughby, and her disappointment was almost too great to bear. Just then, the gentleman called to her, and she recognised Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, and she smiled at him, holding back her tears. After the greetings, however, she watched with growing surprise his polite and distant behaviour to Eleanor, which was very unlike a lover's. And when she heard that he had already been in Devonshire for a fortnight, without coming to see Eleanor, she almost began to feel dislike for him. "Have you been to Sussex recently?" asked Eleanor. "I was at Norland about a month ago," replied Edward. "How does dear, dear Norland look?" cried Marianne. "Dear, dear Norland," said Eleanor, "probably looks much the same as it usually does at this time of year, the woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves." "Oh," cried Marianne, "those falling leaves gave me such delight. How I used to love seeing them driven around me by the wind. Now there is no one to watch them, no one to care." "It is not everyone," said Eleanor, "who has your passion for dead leaves." They all returned to the cottage together, where Edward received the kindest possible welcome from Mrs. Dashwood. Under her warm influence, he began to lose his shyness, or coldness, and to become more like himself. But he still did not seem cheerful. This was noticed by the whole family. "Well, Edward," said Mrs. Dashwood after dinner, "what are your mother's plans for you at present? Does Mrs. Ferrars still want you to be a politician?" "No. I hope my mother realises I can never do that. I am afraid she and I will never agree in our choice of a profession for me. As you know, I did not enjoy studying law. I have always preferred the church, but that is too ordinary for my family." "So how are you to become famous? Because that is what all your family wants, I understand." "I shall not attempt it. I have no wish to be grand or important, and I have every reason to hope I never shall be." "I know you are not ambitious, Edward." "No. I wish, like everybody else, to be perfectly happy, but in my own way. Greatness will not make me happy." "How right you are!" cried Marianne. "What has wealth or greatness to do with happiness?" "Greatness has very little," said Eleanor, "but wealth has much to do with it." "Eleanor," cried Marianne, shocked, "money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. Beyond answering our basic needs, money is of no use to us at all." "Perhaps," said Eleanor, smiling, "we may agree in the end. Your basic needs and my wealth are very much alike, I expect. Come, what is your basic figure?" 2,000 a year, not more than that." Eleanor laughed. 2,000 a year. 1 is my wealth. I guessed what you would say. And yet 2,000 a year is not a large income. A family cannot live on less. The right number of servants, a carriage, and horses for riding cannot be paid for with less than that. Eleanor smiled again to hear her sister describing so accurately her future life with Willoughby. During Edward's visit, Eleanor was careful to behave to him with her usual politeness and interest. But in her heart, she was alarmed by his coldness towards her. It was clear that he was unhappy, and she doubted very much whether he still loved her. She could see, however, that his feelings were confused. Sometimes, for a moment, he looked at her as he used to, and this gave her hope again. The next day, as Marianne was passing some tea to Edward, she noticed a ring on his finger and mentioned it. "I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward," she cried. "Is that your sister's hair in the ring? But surely hers is darker." Edward blushed deeply, and looking quickly at Eleanor said, "Yes, it is Fanny's hair. It looks lighter than it really is." Eleanor had met his eye and knew the truth. She felt sure that the hair was her own, but it must have been taken from her without her knowing. She was not in the mood, however, to disapprove of this action, and changed the subject quickly. The Dashwoods were sorry to hear that Edward had to leave them after only a week. Although he expressed his great pleasure at seeing such old friends, and could give no good reason for his departure, there seemed to be something forcing him to leave. Eleanor blamed his mother for his rather odd behaviour. His lack of cheerfulness could easily be explained by his lack of independence. She wondered when, if ever, his mother would finally drop all her ambitions for him and allow him to make his own choices in life. A more comforting thought was the memory of his pleasant looks and words to her during his visit, and above all, the proof of his affection that he wore round his finger. In spite of the painfulness of Edward's departure, Eleanor was determined to hide her feelings and show a brave face to the world. Doing this did not lessen her sadness, but at least prevented her family from worrying about her. Marianne could not admire such behaviour, so unlike her own. She believed that self-control was easy for calm natures like Eleanor's, and simply impossible for passionate ones like hers. One morning, soon after Edward had left, Sir John and Lady Middleton and Mrs. Jennings came to visit the Dashwoods, bringing with them Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. Charlotte Palmer was Mrs. Jennings' younger daughter, but was completely unlike her sister, Lady Middleton, in every way. She was short and rather fat, and had a very pretty face and smiled or laughed all the time. Her husband was a serious-looking young man who made no effort to please or be pleased. He read the newspaper for most of the visit, only lifting his head from time to time to give a cross, unsmiling answer to his wife's foolish questions. She, however, took an immediate liking to Eleanor and Marianne, and spent much time in conversation with Eleanor in particular. When Eleanor realised that their home was in Somerset, near Willoughby's, she hoped to hear more about his character, so she asked Mrs. Palmer if they knew him. "Oh, yes, I know him extremely well," replied Mrs. Palmer. "Not that I ever spoke to him, indeed, but I have often seen him in town. Everybody likes and admires him. I know very well why you ask. I am delighted that your sister is to marry him." "You know much more of the matter than I do," said Eleanor, surprised, "if you have any reason to expect that." "Don't pretend it's not true, because you know it's what everybody in London is talking of." "My dear Mrs. Palmer, on my honour, they all talk of it. I met Colonel Brandon on Bond Street, and he told me of it immediately." "You surprise me very much. I would not expect Colonel Brandon to give such information, even if it were true." "Well, when I met him, I said, 'Colonel, I hear there is a new family at Barton Cottage, and Mamma says the girls are very pretty, and that one of them is engaged to Mr. Willoughby. Is it true?' And he said nothing, but from his expression I knew it was certain. Of course, I have known Colonel Brandon a long time. I believe," she added in a low voice. "He would have been very glad to marry me if he could. But Mamma did not think him a good enough husband for me. In any case, I am much happier as I am. Mr. Palmer is just the kind of man I like." Chapter 5. Lucy Steele's Secret. The Palmers returned to Somerset the next day, but it was not long before Sir John had more visitors at Barton Park. On a morning's excursion to Exeter, he and his mother-in-law had met two young ladies, the Miss Steeles, whom Mrs. Jennings discovered to be distant cousins. Sir John, always eager for society, immediately invited them to stay at the park as soon as they were available, and most fortunately, they were able to accept the invitation almost at once. The young ladies arrived. Their appearance was by no means unfashionable, their dress was elegant, and their manners were very polite. They were delighted with the house and furniture, and they happened to be so madly fond of children that Lady Middleton had an excellent opinion of them by the time they had been at the park for an hour. Sir John hurried off to Barton Cottage to tell the Miss Dashwoods. "They are the sweetest girls in the world," he said. Eleanor smiled at this. She knew that, for Sir John, the sweetest girls in the world were in every part of England, with every possible kind of face, figure, and character. Sir John wanted the whole family to walk to the park immediately and look at his guests. Kind, thoughtful man. It was painful to him even to keep a third cousin to himself. But, in spite of his efforts, he could only gain the Dashwoods' promise to visit the park in a day or two. When the promised visit took place, they found nothing to admire in the appearance of the elder Miss Steele, who was nearly 30, with a very plain face. However, the younger, Miss Lucy Steele, who was not more than 23, had a considerable beauty. Her face was pretty, she had a sharp, quick eye, and she held herself with a certain air. Eleanor soon noticed the pleasing manners and constant attentions with which they were winning Lady Middleton's approval. They were full of praise for the beauty and intelligence of her children, and full of admiration for Lady Middleton herself. Fortunately for those who use these clever tricks, a fond mother can never hear enough praise of her children, and therefore will swallow anything. Lady Middleton watched proudly as her spoilt children pulled the Miss Steeles' hair, stole their sewing scissors, and tore their books. She felt no doubt that the Miss Steeles were enjoying this quite as much as her children. She was only surprised that Eleanor and Marianne should sit so calmly, without taking any part in the enjoyment. "How playful dear little William is," she said lovingly, as her second boy violently pulled Miss Steele's finger. "And here is my sweet Anna Maria, such a quiet little thing." She bent to kiss her daughter, but unfortunately a pin in her dress scratched the child's neck. Violent screams rang out, and the Miss Steeles rushed to help the suffering child. The little girl realized that the louder she screamed, the more attention she would receive, and nothing could be done to calm her. Finally, her mother was forced to carry her upstairs in search of her nurse, and the four young ladies were left in a quietness which the room had not known for many hours. "Poor little creature," said the elder Miss Steele. "I do not think there was any real cause for alarm," said Marianne firmly. "What a sweet woman Lady Middleton is," said Lucy Steele. Marianne was silent, as it was impossible for her to say what she did not feel. It was Eleanor who was forced to reply. "She is a very fond mother," she said truthfully. "And the children," cried Lucy. "I love to see children full of life and fun. I cannot bear them quiet." "I confess," replied Eleanor, "that while I am at Barton Park, I never think of quiet children with any displeasure." A short silence was broken by the elder Miss Steele, who suddenly changed the subject by saying, "How do you like Devonshire, Miss Dashwood? I suppose you are very sorry to leave Sussex. Norland is a beautiful place, is it not?" "We have heard Sir John admire it," said Lucy quickly. Eleanor was surprised that the Miss Steeles seemed to know so much about her family. Indeed, it is a lovely place.
"And had you a great many handsome young bachelors there?" asked Anne Steele.
I'm afraid you may find it dull here. I do like a place with a lot of good-looking young men, but they must dress well and behave politely. I suppose your brother was quite an elegant young man before he married." "Well," replied Eleanor, "if he was before he married, he still is, because he has not changed at all." "Oh dear, I never think of married men being handsome young men. They have other things to do." "Good heavens, Anne," cried her sister. "You can talk of nothing but young men. You will make Miss Dashwood believe you think of nothing else." And she turned to another subject. This one meeting with the Miss Steeles would have been quite enough for Eleanor, who disliked the vulgar freedom and foolishness of the elder, and the clever pretences of the younger. She left the park without wishing to know them better. The Miss Steeles, however, thought differently, and so did the sociable Sir John. Soon the young ladies of both houses were sitting or walking together for an hour or two almost every day. Anxious that they should get to know each other well, Sir John had helpfully informed the Miss Steeles of all the details of the Dashwoods' lives, and soon Anne Steele congratulated Eleanor on her sister's fortunate engagement to a very fine young man. "What a good thing to be married so young," she added. "I hear he is extremely handsome. I hope you may have such good luck yourself. But perhaps you have someone already." The Miss Steeles also heard from Sir John, with many smiles and jokes, about Eleanor's suspected attachment to a young man who had recently visited Devonshire. "His name is Ferrers," whispered Sir John, so that everyone could hear, "but it's a great secret." "Ferrers?" repeated the elder Miss Steele. "Mr. Ferrers? Your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? A very pleasant young man. We know him very well." "How can you say that, Anne?" cried Lucy, who nearly always corrected everything her sister said. "We have only seen him once or twice at my uncle's." Eleanor was astonished. Who was this uncle? Where did he live? And how did they come to know Edward? She wished very much to have the subject continued, but nothing more was said about it, and she preferred not to ask questions herself. In the next few days, Lucy missed no opportunity of engaging Eleanor in conversation. She was naturally clever and often amusing, and as a companion for half an hour Eleanor found her quite pleasant. However, she knew nothing of books, music, or painting, in spite of her constant efforts to appear well-informed. Eleanor pitied her for her lack of education, but disliked her insincerity, her dishonesty, and the narrow self-interest that lay behind all her words and actions. One day, as they were walking alone together, Lucy said, "You will think my question strange, no doubt, but do you personally know your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrers?" Eleanor did think the question strange. "I have never seen her," she answered a little distantly. "Then you cannot tell me what sort of woman she is?" "No," replied Eleanor, cautious of giving her real opinion of Edward's mother. "I know nothing of her." Lucy looked fixedly at Eleanor. "I wish I could tell you. I hope you will believe I'm not just being curious or impolite." She hesitated. "I do want your good opinion, and I'm sure I would not have the smallest fear of trusting you. Indeed, I would be very glad of your advice. I am in such an uncomfortable situation. I am sorry you do not happen to know Mrs. Ferrers." "I am also sorry," said Eleanor in great astonishment, "if it could be of any use to you to know my opinion of her. But I never understood you were at all connected with that family." "I do not wonder at your surprise. Mrs. Ferrers is nothing to me at present, but the time may come when we may be very closely connected." She looked shyly down as she said this, with only a quick look sideways at Eleanor. "Good heavens!" cried Eleanor. "What do you mean? Connected with Mr. Robert Ferrers?" And she did not feel much delighted with the idea of such a sister-in-law. "No," replied Lucy. "Not with Mr. Robert Ferrars. I never saw him in my life. But," fixing her eyes on Eleanor, "with his elder brother, Edward." Eleanor looked at Lucy in silent astonishment.